This lesson is going to be symbolic logic. So in the previous lesson, we introduced to you these three little dots to mean therefore. So anytime you have sentences and you're trying to make a conclusion, we have those three little dots in a form of a triangle that means therefore. So there are other symbols that we use to ease the pain of writing long sentences. So oftentimes we just don't want to write out the whole sentence. So we have a shorthand, and it's called symbolic logic. So this is our key for symbolic logic. So the symbols that are going to get used, first we have an arrow. So an arrow indicates that you're talking about a conditional statement. It means that you have an if and a then, and the arrow goes between whatever is being the hypothesis and whatever is being the conclusion. And often we will read it as the word implies. We are going to substitute a single letter to represent a hypothesis and a single letter to represent a conclusion. And so it would look something like A implies B or P implies Q. You often hear in symbolic logic, we often use the letters P and Q. I don't really have a reason why they've chosen P and Q as the two letters that they use, especially since P and Q often can look a lot alike, but sometimes we'll see that. The next symbol we have is how do we negate something? So instead of using the word not or taking the word not out, we use this little squiggle, just like a tilde symbol. So it is a squiggle, and that means you are negating it. So if I want to say the opposite of the hypothesis, I might say squiggle H for the opposite of the hypothesis. If I want to say the opposite of the conclusion, I'll say squiggle C for the opposite of the conclusion. If we have one of those biconditional statements, remember what a biconditional was when the statement can be read forwards and backwards, and it has those words if and only if in it. That double-ended arrow replaces the if and only if part. So it goes in the middle between the two parts of the hypothesis and conclusion. And then there are some times where we just have statements. And when we just have statements, we might have a statement that is an and, which is called a conjunction, meaning I need them both to occur. They occur at the same time. The symbol for and is this upside down V. You might call it a caret. A lot of you may have used it in algebra to get yourself to an exponent on a calculator. It's that caret. I've had students call it mountain because it just goes uphill like a mountain. And then disjunction is or. That means one or the other can occur. The symbol for or is the actual V. So another way students have told me is they think of and as it's like writing that capital letter A, but you don't have the thing across it for and. So that's how they have remembered that and is the one that goes up like the capital letter A, or goes down like a valley. And then just to reiterate, the three little dots means therefore. That is what you have a conclusion. So what is it going to look like? Normally, I will give you letters to represent the different parts of the statement. If I don't give you letters, then you first would assign it. Sometimes we'll just pick nice words that associate with something in the sentence. So for instance, here I wrote the P, let P represent the car is running. Sometimes we might hear an R for running. Let Q be the key is in the ignition. I might have a K for key. So I've chosen P and Q here, so we're going to use P's and Q's. So they give you a conditional statement. They say if the car is running, then the key is in the ignition. So since it's an if-then sentence, if-then requires us to connect the hypothesis to the conclusion. So every time we see an if-then, we need that arrow. So I'm going to say my original, the car is running, is P. The conclusion, the key is in the ignition, is Q. And because it's an if-then statement, I am going to connect them with an arrow. So my symbolic logic representing that statement is P arrow Q. So now let's take these symbols and define what would the inverse look like. Remember that the inverse is to insert not. So that means we negate both of them. So I need to negate the P and negate the Q. So it's going to be squiggle P, arrow, squiggle Q. The converse is going to change the order. So just like we did with sentences, I'm going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. That means the P and the Q are going to switch places. It's still an if-then sentence, so it's going to be Q, arrow, P. And then remember that the contrapositive does both, so we're going to change the order. And not. And negate it. So we are going to change the order. So Q is going to come first. P is going to come second. We've got to not them both. And it's an if-then sentence. So squiggle Q, arrow P. So now let's take some other sentences. So using some of the other symbols. So this is not an if-then sentence. It says the car is running and the key is not in the ignition. So since it's not an if-then sentence, I will not be using an arrow. The car is running. We're going to replace it with the letter P. So just like you replace numbers with variables, we're going to replace words with single letters. And the key is not in the ignition. So I see that word and. So that means I'm conjoining two parts of the sentences together. So the symbol for and is that upside down V. So that kind of mountain A shape. And the key is not in the ignition. Well, Q means it is in the ignition, so I need it to have the opposite meaning. So the opposite of Q is squiggle Q. You try these two. See what you can get with them. Okay, hopefully you paused for a second. So I'm going to go through. The key is in the ignition. No changes have been made, so that's just Q. I see that word or. So or is that V symbol. The car is not running. Well, P means it is running, so I need to have the opposite of P, so squiggle P. And now let's take this sentence. The key is in the ignition if and only if the car is running. I see that if and only if, so that tells me I'm talking about a biconditional. So that means I'm going to have a double-ended arrow. And the part that's on the first side or on the left-hand side is the key is in the ignition, so that's Q. And the part that's on the right, the car is running, that is P. So, you try. So you take a moment, you try these four, pause, and then check yourself. Okay, let's check your answers. So they started out telling you we're going to let R be Rachel is singing, T be Ted is crying. So the first sentence says is Ted is not crying, then Rachel is singing. So if I lift that up, you should have squiggle T, arrow R. I'm going to go the sentence below it. I used that therefore, so I need to have those three little dots in a triangular form. Ted is crying, which is T, and Rachel's not singing, which is squiggle R. And I had the and symbol in between. On the right-hand side, Rachel is not singing, so the opposite of R, or that V symbol. Ted is crying, which is T, so I have squiggle R or T. And finally, my biconditional, Rachel is not singing, so squiggle R. If and only if, double-ended arrow, Ted is crying. Now, of course, just like everything in math, we teach you to go forward and then we teach you to go backwards. So now I have given you some letters of the alphabet. P is going to be representing the sky is blue. Q is going to be representing the water is not clean. T is going to be representing the grass needs mowing. So now I've given you a symbolic statement, and I want you to create a sentence that symbolic statement is representing. So P represents the sky is blue. The arrow tells me it's an if-then sentence. So the minute I see that arrow, I have to remember that this sentence needs to start with the word if, must start with the if, and it's going to have a then in the middle of it. And then squiggle Q means I need to be the opposite of what Q says. Q says the water is not clean. So the opposite of that is the water is going to be clean. Let's not say the water is not clean. So let's put that all together. It's an if then, so I start with if. P, the sky is blue. The arrow, again, is a if-then sentence. Opposite of Q, instead of saying it's not clean, the water is clean. Let's try another one. This time, again, another arrow, so I know it has to be an if-then sentence. Q is not being changed, but P is going to have the opposite. So you try it. Take a minute, write down what that sentence would look like. The most common error I see in times of changing from symbolic to sentences is when I see that arrow, make sure your sentence starts with the word if. So if the water is not clean, then, because it's an arrow, opposite of P, the sky is not blue. These sentences make absolutely no sense, but that's because I really want to make sure that you just understand how to use the symbols. So T, that little upside down V and Q, remember that means and. The ands and the ors, there's no arrows here, so it's not an if-then sentence. So it's going to be a statement. So we're going to leave T alone, leave Q alone, and connect them with the word and. So T is the grass needs mowing. And conjunction, Q, the water is not clean. So you take a minute and try the last two. Pause the video so that you don't look ahead. So hopefully you took a minute, paused. Let's check your answers. So for squiggle P, the opposite of P, so the sky is not blue. It's not an if-then. It just has a disjunction of or. And T doesn't change. The grass needs mowing. Last one, three little dots. Therefore, opposite of T. The grass doesn't need mowing. And that is symbolic logic.